Good morning. Hi, I'm the Hermit of Lockyer, and I'm coming today with another conversation. I got up early this morning around 5, and it was too dark to film, and it's too cold to be outside. There goes my ducks. We have hundreds of ducks on our lake in the winter. It was too cold to come outside. I have a lot of cold intolerance now that I've been ill. But now the sun is up. It's later. It's like after 8. Come down to the lake and continue our conversation. I'm happy that I slept fairly well last night, which is new because I've been struggling with an edge of pneumonia for a month, and I didn't cough so much last night. But also I've been thinking this morning, I really want to thank you guys for coming and listening to me in this conversation. It means more to me than you can imagine. I do live a life of a hermit primarily. I go out for coffee once a week. And I got pneumonia from actually taking some liberties and going to some public events a few weeks ago. And now I've been sick to pay for it. But I don't have any outlet for my thoughts. I've been working at these thoughts and reading and studying and praying and meditating for 30 years, and I tried writing a book once, The Butterflies in the Belfry, to put my thoughts on paper, and that book, it was a hard lesson. It was the only book I've ever had picked up by a major publisher, and then I turned him down. And I looking back now, it's probably a foolish choice of mine, but they wanted to make it a academic book, a extra reading they saw as an extra reading kind of curriculum for seminaries and Bible colleges and things like that. And that wasn't the audience I thought I would seek. So I ended up publishing through our own little company, and that may have been a mistake. It never had a wide reading. And then the problem was those who read it, there's probably people who read it who benefited from it, and it helped them make sense of the world. My writing, I think, has improved a lot since then, too. But the feedback I got were from the haters, the religious haters who have the dogma or have the see themselves as the God's thought police, which I used to see myself that way in the 90s, not in the 90s, in the 80s, and wrote me nasty letters, going to hell kind of letters. And it was painful. And I thought I put years into working on that book, and putting my thoughts down on paper is hard to get these thoughts on paper. And then to have that kind of feedback made it difficult. So I don't have, I really wish I could write a book. And I don't mean it to, be a big blockbuster. I mean, when I wrote Butterflies in the Belfry, the book The Shack had come out, and it was atypical. I mean, it had God as a older, I think, heavy black woman. So that was, very different. But it was a big seller among evangelicals, and maybe I had delusions of grandeur that my book wouldn't do that good, but would have some readership. But I feel like I'm this little voice in a world that's going in one direction, and I'm the salmon swimming upstream against that tide. And that's okay. I accept that few people agree with me or understand what I'm saying. Some people do. One of my big things I've been speaking against for a long time has been postmodernism. And postmodernism has gone to seed, or starting to go to seed, and we're pivoting away from it. Because postmodernism ushered in another epoch of the loss of truth. It's not the first time. last time I was talking about these cycles of philosophy that's gone through over the last 2,000 years. The Dark Ages was another time. We have not entered the Dark Ages again, nor will we, because the rational genie is out of the bottle that came out with Enlightenment. And it's been so profoundly beneficial for humanity. We'll never go back. I don't see us ever going back to the Dark Ages. But there's a little Dark Ages that we're in right now. A Time magazine called, I think I've said this before, 2016, the year that truth died. And I'm going to be talking going forward a lot about truth. And I try to ad-lib these things, so I'm trying to keep my thoughts coherent so I don't lose anyone. And I do ask you to try to stay with me. I'm going to try to make this as clear as I can. It's really very simple things I'm saying. But jumping ahead here, I'm going to go back, and what I started to say was I'm really grateful that you come to this conversation. If I have 5 people, I'll keep doing this. It gives me something to do, an outlet for my thoughts, because I have no other outlets. I actually got more involved with our church this past year in the adult ministries and thinking I could create some Sunday school classes where I could share some of my thoughts and things. To me, it didn't go very well. I don't think the group understood where I was going. And then the only feedback I did get back from the few Sunday school classes I did was not very positive. So I realized, my life is short. Why do I put all this work into something and then get negative feedback? So, and I don't blame anyone. They're good people. And I'll say this again, so no one takes me wrong. I am going to the best church I've ever gone to in my life, or have been going to it. So if I become less involved, it's not because the church has failed as a specific church. It's just that the general culture, I no longer relate to. And it's filled with, I've said before, it's filled with wonderful people who are better than me. So I'm not here criticizing people in church. But in conclusion, I'm just saying I'm really grateful for you coming and listening, and I hope I'm making sense in a world that sometimes doesn't make sense. There is, excuse me. There is a verse in Colossians 2:8. I had it memorized a long time ago, and I misinterpreted it when I memorized it as evangelical, and I think a lot of people do too. I'm going to read it because I had to have it memorized. Colossians 2:8. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and these elementary spiritual forces of the world rather than on Christ. When I was told to memorize that in the 80s, the key word there that was used was philosophy. The evangelicalism I was involved with is awash in conspiracy theories. So the word philosophy became, it's like the devil, philosophy and the devil are in together. And it wasn't until the 90s when I had left Christianity and started to come back, and I started reading Francis Schaeffer things. Francis Schaeffer is a theologian, but he spoke in philosophical terms. And now I agree with that. I agree that philosophy is simply the love of truth or love of knowledge. And I find it clean and simple, because if you get into theology, suddenly you're in this swamp, this quagmire of doctrine, of anger, of emotions, and all this stuff. There's been so many wars fought over religion. I don't know of a single war ever fought over philosophy. So that verse is not saying philosophy is bad. I actually see philosophy as one of God's favorite sciences, because it's a pursuit of truth. So if there is a God, this God has to be within the realm of truth. It makes no sense to say that there is a God that exists, but that God lives in a world of superstition and untruth. So this verse is saying, don't be taken captive by deceptive philosophies. So I got called out on this just a couple of months ago, and it's very painful that I used the word philosophy, and I just said what I just said now, that I really enjoy approaching things from a philosophical standpoint. And someone tried to use that to point out that I'm not a real Christian. It's my understanding of what they're saying, because Christians don't dabble in philosophy. It's just frustrating. But so they were interpreting it just like I did as evangelical, that philosophy is specific philosophies. There's evil philosophies. Nazism is a philosophy. So I wasn't saying I love all philosophies. I'm trying to think of an analogy of this. It's like, I don't know, um, I like baking. Okay, that means you eat bread all day long. No, I don't eat bread. There's good bread, there's bad bread. You know what I'm saying is that philosophy is just a school of seeking truth and knowledge. And in this verse, the problem is deceptive philosophies and based on human tradition. Tradition is another word. I was trying to look up the Greek word for that. The Greek word philosophy is really very simple. It's the basis of our word philosophy, the love of knowledge or wisdom or truth. Um, but tradition is what I've been talking about. I've been deconstructing the Christian culture. Tradition is culture, so it's saying don't be taken captive. And the word captive in that verse is the same word that, back in those days, an army would come in, attack a city, and carry off people as slaves, as wives, and those people that carried off were called captives. So this is the same word. It says don't be carried off as a captive by these philosophies. They're based on culture. And that's exactly what I've been talking about. I'm trying to deconstruct culture. And the Christian culture, certainly not all of it's evil. There's been good things, but it's just not been taken captive by it. People leave Christianity, a lot of them, because they see black and white. Either you go to church every Sunday and you're involved with this Christian culture that's evolved over 2,000 years, that are, in my opinion, is a man-made system. If you don't do that, then you have to leave God completely. I've been reading a lot of research, and it's not really clear. It hasn't helped me that much because you read one paper and it says one thing, another paper says another thing. But one of the common reasons people leave Christianity is that they don't relate to the Christian culture anymore. That's if you would sum up most of the reasons people leave, it's probably the biggest reason, if you put it in those general terms. That they don't relate to the culture. But it's interesting that once they've left, and another thing that's interesting, they don't come back. I've heard evangelicals say, oh, let them leave in their 20s. They always come back time they have children. That's not true. Absolutely not true. Especially among millennials. They're not coming back. They're gone. They're lost. And the church is hemorrhaging these people. And no one seems to care that much. Or if they care, they just want to create another culture, another entertainment. Let's show movies at church. That'll keep the kids here. And it's just, they don't understand the root problem. Then that's what I'm hoping to address. So they don't come back, but they're rejecting the culture. And that's why I'm deconstructing the culture. And what I was going to say, I'm trying to remember the exact statistics, but about 70%, 60 or 70% still say they believe in God. The questions I saw in the surveys didn't ask if they still believe in Christ. But I want to give people the option of understanding the historical Jesus and falling in love with that historical Jesus and what he said, not what the Republican Party says, not what the evangelicals say, not what the Catholics say, not what the New Age postmodernist Christians are saying. None of that. None of that. Just flush it. But just go back, read the Beatitudes, read the Sermon on the Mount. Christianity is profoundly simple, and that's been my message. I'm going to make a transition now going forward. And, again, I'm still on the same theme about the church is dying, and there's no way to change that. I go to church. When I go to my church, all I see is white hair, bald heads. And I think that is the goal of the church, is to retain those people by giving them a memory of church. Not, it's more than that. I don't want to downplay it. But, I used to be an elder, and I'd bring up, the church is dying, and people look at me in anger, like I said something offensive, but I think it makes them uncomfortable to say we're losing this battle. Less than half Americans now go to church. And that's not a bad thing. I think it can be a fantastic thing. I think we need to just let the culture die and go back and rediscover just simple things about living in following Christ. That's all. So this transition I'm going to make, and if you follow me for the next few weeks, I'm going to be talking a lot about truth, because this morning I got up at 5 and I read a PhD thesis that someone had written in 2017 on why people are leaving Christianity. It was interesting, but it wasn't clear And I think it wasn't clear because of the way the questions were asked. I wish I could do a survey of thousands of people and ask the questions better. But I started looking, because all the answers, they had like 10 answers why people are in the church. And all of them were, I don't think any of them broke 20%. Some of the big ones were hypocrisy. That was up there. They don't like the church stance on gay issues because, again, I mentioned that they have family members who are gay, and the church preached against it. Too much politics in the church. That was up there about 18%. And just don't believe anymore. But I was trying to look for this theme, and I honestly think the theme is the issue of truth. Now, I'm going to define truth because no one seems to understand what I'm saying when, at least the first time I say it. If you've been around my blogs, you've heard me say this over and over. Religious people use the word truth, and political people do too, and as a manipulative term. They don't mean truth the way I mean truth. I am talking about classical truth, the kind of things that Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and all these people talked about when they talked about truth. And it's that which is consistent with reality. That's all it is. That which is true. And I've talked about this before. It's not a religious idea. You know, the big term I hear a lot from my evangelical friends is God's truth. What they mean by that is not the same as what I'm talking about. They're talking about dogma. They have a long list of dogmas that you must believe are your garbage. You know, this I talk about social coercion. It's always, you know, the things that people weigh you on. Are you smart? Are you cool? Are you good? And in the evangelical circles, all these dogmas. And I remember going to church, and if you taught a Sunday school class and said something that someone misunderstood, you had hell to pay because you violated that dogma. And that's what they mean by God's truth. And often God's truth is what they use the term for is to cover up for a bunch of lies or things, or baseless things. So I'm going to tell some stories this morning as an introduction. And then at the very end of this, I hope I don't make this too long. It's the holidays and I know people are busy. But I'm going to end this with talking about a philosophical term of Platonic Dualism, which I won't talk about that too much. But as this transition, I've been talking about culture. Last time I talked about how thinking has evolved over 2,000 years. We're now in the postmodern age. I go to a Tuesday night group. It's very postmodern. And I've been speaking against this for 30 years, so it's a conflict that I have. It's like fingernails on a chalkboard to me. It makes me depressed. But anyway, so I'm going to be talking about truth a lot. And I'm going to get down to really specific things, you know, neurophysiology, how we find truth. Because I think it's the profound cornerstone of this whole mess. Because again, if God exists, God created the cosmos. God created reality. God created metaphysics. God created all this stuff. So the closer you are to reality, the closer you are to God. But religion wants to take you away from reality. And that's been one of the big problems. So I'm going to reflect that in these stories. So the first story I want to tell happened in the 70s. And I tell this story, I think, if I remember right, I've written eight books, and I can't remember what's in different books, but I think in Butterflies and Belfry, I tell this story. I was living in a dorm at East Tennessee State University, and this was in the 70s, and I was involved with the Navigators, and we were very evangelistic, going, knocking on doors, trying to share the gospel, starting Bible studies. And there's a guy on our floor. He's a little bit of a nerdy kind of guy. He didn't seem like he had a lot of friends, but I invited him to a Bible study that I was having in my dorm room. And he looked at me, and he said, I think his name was Steve. Steve looked at me and said, I go to a Bible study. And on an impulse, just to be kind to him, I said, maybe I should go with you to your Bible study. He said, okay. So later that week, I went with Steve. And he's an interesting guy. To me, he was, because he was Catholic, and I grew up as a Baptist, and Catholics were the other. We didn't know much about them. Our preachers always preached that Catholics were going to hell. sad. Anyway, but we had no sense of the history of the Catholic Church. I mean, the fact that it's been the bastion of Christianity for 1,500 years. So anyway, they were all going to hell, according to our Baptist preachers. But anyway, I went with Steve to this group, and it met at a big frame house right off campus, and that place was packed. If I remember right, I think there were 60 people packed in this living room and kitchen and dining room of this house, and it was all centered around this man. And this man, I was studying psychology at the time, so I should have known better. But this man had this gift of gab that you see in people. You know what? Some people, I had a relative say, I seem like I have the gift of gab in these videos. Excuse me. But what I'm talking about, gift of gab, is I'm trying to name some people. You probably know them. But charismatic people. And I mean as a personality. Donald Trump is a great example. To me, he has no brain, but he has a big mouth. He talks nonsense, lies, and this is not political. This is dealing with the issue of truth. So I can say that. I felt myself retreating from criticizing Donald Trump because everybody said I was political. I'm not political. I can say the same thing about Bill Clinton. I thought Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton were very pretentious until I met Donald Trump. But anyway, so Donald Trump, I haven't heard a lot of Rob Bell. He's evolved over time, I understand. He was, he's a very populist. He had the largest church in America, if I remember right, for a while. So he's a very populist guy. Gift of gab, he can speak forever and sound real exciting and doesn't engage his brain. The things I hear him say, I think, where's the evidence of that? There is no evidence. But anyway, they have this gift of gab. So I got off on a tangent. I went to this meeting in his house, and I was way in the back. It wasn't me college students. It's mostly people from the community. And we were so packed in. And this guy was very dynamic. He was a door-to-door salesman, and it fit his personality. But sitting there, first of all, he had this emotional dishonesty that I found so prevalent in my evangelical days. And this is emotional, just an example of emotional dishonesty. It's where you pretend to be very, very humble. And he would comment, everybody knows me as a very humble servant I'm just a servant of Jesus, I'm full of flaws. And he'd say things like that. Oh, he's so humble. But then he'd tell these stories straight from God. And every story he told had him at the center of being a hero. And one story I remember, he was doing his door-to-door, or he actually called on companies selling them something. I can't remember what. And he said he walked in his company, and this woman who had never met just stopped and looked at him and said, "You have Jesus, don't you?" And he said, "I do." She said, "It radiates from your body, the presence of Jesus." And I'll bet you 100% that was a complete lie. In the evangelical days, the more charismatic you are, the more you lie. This is what I found. And then I'll get back to that story. But Francis Schaeffer, the theologian I followed a lot, and he's not perfect, but his son tells a story about they lived in Switzerland, so they weren't really exposed to this nonsense that's in the American Christian church so much. And they came over, and they were going to appear on the 700 Club, and I forgot the guy's name. You know who I'm talking about. Ran for president. The leader of the 700 Club. But they stayed at his house that night in Norfolk, Virginia, I think it was where he lived. That's where his program aired from. They were going to do an interview the next morning, but they came out, they got in his car and drove to the studio. And when he got on the air, he looked at the cameras and said, "This morning I came out of my house and I walked in the garage and there was rattlesnakes everywhere in my garage. And I stepped over them." And then he quotes a verse about, the snakes will not bite you and stuff. And Francis Schaeffer and his son Frankie looked at you and said, "That's bullshit. That never happened." But that's the way those things are. But this is the kind of guy this was. If I think of the preacher I'm thinking of on the 700 Club, I'll mention him. But I went to this meeting. I'm getting back to my story. I went to this meeting. Place was packed, and this guy kept telling stories and stories. And then they started getting into this miracle stuff where everybody's chattering and supposedly speaking in tongues and throwing their arms up and rolling around on the floor, and people have been slain in the spirit and passing out and all this stuff. And it just seemed like total chaos. It didn't seem like something of God to me. But then he got into a healing session, and I looked around the group, and here's what shocked me was my high school science teacher was in this group, and I'd been involved with a lot of science fairs, and this guy was a very rational guy, and here he is involved with this emotional. They would never use the word emotional. It had to be the spirit. And, it's like this hierarchy of experiences with God. This was way up there because it's totally irrational. But then this guy got into this healing thing. And I may try to demonstrate this, but he looked around the group and God was speaking to him. It's, Gnostic. That means it's a truth, that knowledge that comes straight to God into the brain. And this is how this segues into talking about truth. And he would call out people in the group. There's a woman that just got out of the hospital with back surgery, and he called her up. They brought her out, and he was doing this. Every single person that was sick, no matter if it was a heart problem, seizures, diabetes, whatever, he could diagnose it with God's help. They all had one leg longer than the other. Seriously. That was his diagnosis. And he did a sleight of hand trick that we did in elementary school, where he hold on to the pants legs. He didn't call women up with a dress for this reason. And if I could demonstrate, but I'm just have to talk about it because I can't put my camera down. He would hold on to the hem of their pants and slide it up their leg, and it gives an illusion their leg is growing. It's something that 5-year-olds would do. But people in the group were just praising God and falling on the floor as if he was raising dead people from the grave. That was that intense. And I said, what is going on here? This is total craziness. And then this woman who just had back surgery, he did this to her, and then he would yank people up and say, you're healed, you're healed. If you ever watched Oral Roberts, if you're old enough to remember, it's this type of crap that was going on. And it's crap because it's lies. It's lies in the name of God. And to me, that's just crap. So he jerked these people up, and those with diabetes, they would shout, I'm healed, I'm healed. They probably threw away their insulin and died later that year. Those who had cancer stopped their chemotherapy and died later that year. And I see him as a murderer. And he kills people for his own ego. That's why that's looking at this, frankly. So this lady back surgery, I made him yanking her up, and she screamed because it hurt so bad. And he had just healed her, so she shouldn't be screaming. So then he said, God has come to me with a voice. He says, there's sin in her life. There's sin. She's turned her back on God. And they carried her, and she's crying. She just had back surgery. Now he yanked her up, and now he's accusing her in front of these 60 people of being full of sin. And they carried her in the bedroom. So he had the women go back and pray with her to get her to repent from the sin that's blocking his healing. And I want to crawl out a window. I felt so sad that this was being done in the name of Jesus. And then he calls on me. He said, son, I see that you have back trouble. And I was just leaning against the window. I said, no, I don't. He said, yeah, you do. I can see the way you're standing. You have scoliosis. I don't have scoliosis. So the crowd pulls me to the front and sets me on this chair. And he starts, God is saying this man is, has scoliosis, and I'm going to heal him right before your eyes. And he grabs my pants leg and starts sliding up. And I grabbed his hand, and I pushed it back down. And he just stopped. And he was furious at me. And he turned around to the group and said, God just told me this man is full of sin, and is blocking. And all these people are in here. I see my science teacher in the back, and never even said hi to me that night. He didn't want any personal contact. So that was that night. I went home very, very sad. This was profound loss of truth. If there is a God who created a cosmos, would God be doing sleight of hand tricks? Is that the God, that's tiny little God that we've created? That's what this was. And everybody thought it was this great experience with God, and it was just sad. But now, 2 weeks later, Steve, one day, he lived in town. His mom and dad did. And I comment in my book, his mother is the first old lady. She's probably in her upper 30s or 40s. I'm 19 or 20. That I felt attracted to. She's just a gorgeous woman. I'm like a supermodel. But we went to his house. His dad's at work to do laundry. He asked me, you want to go do laundry? And it saves me a lot of money. And sure, and I went to his house, and we walk in. He said, Mom's car's here. Mom. And there's no answer in the house. So we go down to the basement. We're doing laundry. And we're down there for a while. And all of a sudden we hear it creaking in the floor. upstairs. So, oh, Mom is here. She must have been in bed with a migraine. So we run up the steps, and we catch coming out of the bedroom door, their clothes partially on, this preacher who was doing all the healing, and his mother. And her blouse was button crooked. They both had wine glasses, and he had a bottle of wine. And he was like a deer in the headlights, but, he's the gift of gab. He said, "Hi, men. I'm just here. We've been praying for the lost souls of Johnson City, and we've been having communion with the Lord," and all this stuff. And I'm sitting there, no, I think you're in there having sex with my friend's mother because his dad's at work. This is the hypocrisy and the emotional dishonesty that I witnessed, not at that level. I'm telling you a rather ambitious story to illustrate a point of the kinds of things that I said Christianity is no longer true. And that's why I think truth is very, very important. I'm going to tell one more little story to bring this up to date. Just a couple of years ago, I had a long conversation with one of my Navigator roommates. He's now a pastor. Was a very smart guy, but I went one direction. In 1990, I left evangelicalism. He stayed in very, very conservative evangelicalism. So, and again, I bring up Donald Trump. He's a good example of loss of truth. That's why Time magazine in 2016 said it's a year that truth died. But Donald Trump, throughout his whole life, I'm not political. Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton were high on my list, so they're Democrats until Trump came along. But I knew he was a Trump supporter, so I just want to try to figure this out. And he had commented, I think, by email that he's a Trump supporter because Trump is so biblical. And that's why there's something wrong with the culture that arrives at that conclusion. Go back and simply study the historical Jesus. You won't see any evidence of Trump being in comparison to the Jesus of history. So, I love this guy. He's been very good to me, this friend. And I'll never turn my back. I said before, I take a bullet for him. I love him so much. But I want to understand this. But before the conversation was over, I think I counted 10 conspiracy theories that he believes 100%. Not only was the 2020 election stolen by Democrats, every election, including John F. Kennedy, that's won by Democrats, has been stolen with the help of Satan to steal elections, because the vast majority of Americans are evangelicals. That's just simply not true. And when liberals win, it means the election was stolen. That's just one. Joe Biden runs the largest mafia family in history. I've seen no evidence of that. If it was, I think he should go to prison. But where's the evidence? I asked him, where's the evidence? Well, you're blind. You don't see the evidence. Not only that, but Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden were involved with, you heard about this Pizzagate, the child pornography ring. And I said, where is the evidence of this? Where is the evidence of this conspiracy theory? So climate change is a conspiracy theory. There's no climate change. COVID is a conspiracy theory. Black Lives Matter is a communist conspiracy theory. We went on and on and on. But I remember when I was an evangelical, and this comes back to the issue of truth. We did not have truth. There was no evidence of the things we were saying. A big one is the gay agenda, that the gays were out to convert all of our babies into gay people, and they're going to do it through Teletubbies and pink M&Ms, and just stuff just crazy stuff. And so we didn't have any evidence for that, zero. But we throw out conspiracy theories. Oh yeah, it's obvious, but you can't find the evidence because the news are in on this deep state, this conspiracy crap. So my point is, and I said to this guy on the phone, I brought up this thing that the church is dying. He said, not my church. My church is growing like crazy. We're full of young people. So after the phone conversation, I looked up his specific denomination of church, and it turned out it's the oldest church in America, talking about age of the members. So, which that's a great sign. It's a church that's dying faster than any other church. So millennials and others, this is one of the big reasons that they've left Christianity, is this loss of truth. Now, Francis Schaeffer, and I keep going back to him, And again, he was my hero, yeah, but he's not perfect. There's several things that he said I disagree with. And on a personal level, he had some issues with anger and other things like that. So he's not, he helped me a lot. But, if I mention him too much, it's not hero worship, I don't believe. But he was warning in the 60s about the loss of reason. And I'm going to get into reason a lot in the future. And he was worried about the loss of reason in the secular world, in the postmodern world. But now loss of reason is once again, it's always gripped Christianity, but now it's gripping Christianity even stronger in this postmodern influence it's had. So I'm here. I'm saying the church is dying, and one of the common denominators of why people are leaving is this loss of truth. Lots of truth, emotional truth, like this preacher in this house, deceptive stuff. And if you don't believe me, I tell people to do this little exercise. I don't mean to pick on pastors, but there's not a better search. You can't do a search term on good Christian. You can do a search term on pastors, but just do a Google search on pastor arrested. And you'll see how many pastors have been arrested for, child pornography, for stealing church money, and because they're just, they're just human beings, but there's this pretense. That's why I call it Barbie land, that there's somehow, that in Christianity, all these people are saints and they don't do bad things. So I know I seem to have rambled. I tried to get a lot in this morning. I'm going to close with one thing to continue this conversation forward. I'm going to talk, I'm drift from this very, in the weeds, I'm trying to think of the term that they use these days. But anyway, a very practical approach to now a more philosophical approach. And in philosophy, we talk about particulars and universals. Universals are the big ideas that influence everyone, and particulars are the little day-to-day things that happen. I've been talking about particulars. I'm going to talk about universals for just a moment. To tie this in with my last conversation, I talked about how throughout history that Plato had a big influence on the church. He had a big influence on the church through Augustine. That influence, the church really struggled with, I don't want to blame everything on Plato. Someone who's really studied philosophy said it's not that simple, and I agree it's not that simple, but I'm going to try to keep it simple and use Plato as my scapegoat. I think if Plato had lived 500 years, his hair would curled. I think it was already curly. He would have been upset with the way his ideas were carried forward by the church and other people. And that is what we call Platonic dualism, or another term is metaphysical dualism. I know it's a big word, but metaphysics has to do with reality, structure of the land, of the cosmos, of reality. And Plato sort of started to set up this dualism that there's two realms. There's what Plato would say is the material realm, which is the earth. Yeah, let me do a list to help illustrate this. The earth, the cosmos, science, talking about all the things, all the empirical things that you can look at, you can study. And also us, our bodies are material. So hunger is material. All those things are material that you think of a biological system. Now, in those days, they had poor understanding of the psyche and the brain. And so the word psyche and soul are the same root word in Greek. And they attributed this to the soul. So the soul was more in the other realm. So there's material realm and there's the other realm of, Plato used several terms, ether. I think I'll use the term, I'm trying to think of a good term you can remember. Besides ether, ideal. Well, forms. That's Plato's thing is called theory of forms. So there's a material world, and then there's a world of forms, or the word that religious people use is spiritual. So there's the material and the spiritual. It's a dichotomy, a dualism. Christianity falsely declared the physical world as inferior to the spiritual. Therefore, human reason was put down into the material, the brain, material thinking, hunger, those things are all material, were inferior to the unseen world, which they declared as the spiritual. Now, this became so bad in the early church, the church was almost split because it affects the person of Christ. And that's why I believe, and I can be wrong about lots of things, that Jesus was God who came into physical form and lived in a material world to bridge that gap, or to show that the material world was of great value. And but the early church started to say, wait a minute. If Jesus lived in the physical world, he could not be God, because the physical world is nasty, dirty. So either Jesus wasn't the Son of God, or he was God, but he never appeared in a real body. He was always a ghost. Because you can't have it both ways. If you put up this divide between the material and the spiritual, and that divide is not, that's this been taken captive by deceptive philosophies based on tradition. That's what that was. The church actually responded well to that, but they had several great creeds, meetings where they declared, talking about, they call it Christology, I think, of declaring that Jesus is man, human in the flesh, and God. So, because they kept distorting that, there were several cults that sprung up, including Manichaeism, which Augustine was part of for almost 10 years, which said this physical world was of the devil or of a lesser god, I can't remember, and only the spiritual had value. But the problem with that, and I'm going to get into this later, is the way that we find truth is through reason. And I'm going to spell that out clearly. And God gave us reason as a gift, as a tool for finding truth. But when you declare reason as of the flesh, and Gnosticism, where you get imagined truth, like this pastor in this house, where God speaks directly into your brain, and you discard emotions, and you discard the psychological. You know, the Bible itself says the human psyche, it uses the word heart, but it's translated heart, but it's psyche. The human psyche is the most deceptive thing in all of creation. So when you say truth is coming directly into your brain, you're talking about your psyche, your emotions. And therefore, you can pervert anything you want and call it truth. But anyway, keep that in mind. I hope this has been interesting. And I'm sorry about my over enthusiasm with some of my storytelling. You guys have a Merry Christmas. I'll be back in a week, I hope.